Welcome back to Storytime with Hollow. This is right where we belong. It's chapter 7 of Captain Fluk's story. The name of this chapter is Depths. There's a lot to cover here, so I should probably get into it pretty quick. But this is the final chapter that he's writ so far, like he's wrote. So there's no more after this. So there'll be probably a long period of time between the next episode. Hopefully he writes more. Damn him. But yeah, spam him about it. Maybe that probably get him to do it. Maybe he'll write more. Who knows? All right. Let's start. So, the black, broken spires of molten earth cracked ominously under the weight of Songbird as it slowly landed on the crust of the burnt world, its surface stabbing into the sky almost targeted upwards, leaving behind an aggressive cascade of apocalyptic reminders of war. As far as the eye could see, this charcoal-esque coating turned what was once fields and a sign of growth and fertility into a stark reminder of pain and death. The land that broke and cracked under the ship floated into the air as a fine dust, adding yet more grey to a sky that hadn't seen colour in a long time. The beams of light from Songbird acting as bright eyes across an ashen land that didn't want to be seen, and as it touched down and the moaning of the earth stopped, it felt as if it didn't want to be visited, although as if it knew what it once was and what it had to become. Right, this is a collect mission. Rage, Peace, Hollow, you're outboard with me. Pocket Tide, I want you on guns just in case anything shows up. We ain't flying out, but we can sure as hell shoot 'em down, Fluke stated to the group gathered in the hull of the ship. They stood around preparing their equipment and checking it over. It had been years since anyone had been to this ash fields, and all that surrounded them now were stories, children's tales of horrors that lay before them. And you have the map in your saw, Evans added, as Fluke nodded and held his wrist up. I do. This will guide us straight to the source of uranium. Each of us 4 will carry a tankard and we'll fill them up. Bring them back and you get the joy of putting them into a bomb, Fluke responded, looking up at the scientist whose face turned into a beaming smile at the mention of explosives. Walking over to the panel by the door and pressing a few buttons, it swung open, the cold blackened air thick with ash rushing into the hull like a winter's draft from a volcano. The group recalled as it flickered into their eyes and lungs, adding to the dread they faced at visiting this part of the world. Duke's otherwise perfect hologram flickered in the decrepit breeze through, unnoticed by himself as everyone else shielded their eyes and faces. Fluke pulled his goggles over his eyes, flicking a switch. Yellow lights lit up, their beams dancing across the ash in the air, visible to all. As if on cue, Rage, Hollow and Peace all flipped their own visors down. Rage is resembling a hockey mask made of iron, with 2 large red orbs as the eyes. Peace is a silver skull with deep green eyes, and Hollow's completely black, with a thick blue strip running over the eyes. They picked their weapons up and walked down the ramp as Tide sealed the door behind them. The air in the hull settled, and the room became very quiet. The 4 moved forward across the land slowly. Fluke's wrist projected a small blue glow, directing them closer to a reservoir of uranium. Rage, Hollow and Peace kept close behind due to the limited visibility. Having only been subject to the elements for a brief period of time, their clothes were already black and soldered with ash, the only light cutting through emanating from their masks and their weaponry. Rage's dual pistols hummed and stayed almost constantly up. Peace held his green assault rifle close to his chest, and Hollow relied more on his eyes than the barrel of his gun, keeping it alongside his person. It was on, however, and ready to fire. Fluke strictly followed his wrist, his left hand held aloft, as more of the small blinking light acted as his eyes. His right hand clutched on a large combat shotgun, the black surface blending onto the environment, the yellow glow from the handle all that was given away in the thick air. Their footsteps were heavy, sinking each step like a child on fresh snowfall, except they knew that what they stepped on was the remnants of the world before. Hollow looked around at the small spikes jutting up and saw glimpses of what once stood, the foundations of buildings that had once been crushed under the weight of a foreign army. It's in pictures in books. They all had. He could make out what used to be the streets, houses, cars. He could see the thin and vague outlines of what humanity remnants, and how it had been blanketed by the thick black ash of war. Rage's footsteps were heavy as he looked down, his boots covered and dyed black under the powder they traipsed through. Normally he would have relished the chance to lighten the mood with conversation, but the risk of talking and his mouth becoming full of dreadful taste of this air, even though his full face mask meant it wasn't worth it. They trudged on, following a small blip on Fluke's wrist like the North Star guiding them to a weapon that could take down an empire, the Ragican Empire. Fluke stared at the blip as it led them closer and closer to where they needed to be, only stopping when he suddenly felt a firm hand on his shoulder. Peace, who had a grip that shook Fluke out of his trance, nodded his head forward and Fluke looked up. Out of the impenetrable smog, a deep black chasm that scarred the land had appeared, one he might have walked into following the radar as closely as he had. He watched and stood out against the face of the world as a true sign of battle. Through the surface was coated in the remnants of ash. This deep cut showed the brutality of a world divided, a tear stretching into the darkness that was a haunting wind of a hint, and of its sheer magnitude it encapsulated how horrific a fertile world had become under the siege from the Ragican Empire, and it was exactly where they needed to go next. The group headed forward with trepidation. Hollow's finger had slowly made the loathsome journey, and now it sat rested on the trigger, much like Rage and Peace. They walked along a thick ridge that stood a few feet across. On one side, the ever-glowing wall that led up to the surface, and on one of the others, a sheer drop covered and coated in incredibly thick ash clouds with no clear sight at the bottom. Yet they descended, further and further into the scar that scorched the earth. "Wait, what do you mean I messed up your work?" Evans said to Tide, who was busy in the engine room cleaning out several release valves that had become clogged with ash. "I mean, don't get me wrong, you're a clever guy and all," Tide responded, turning to face the scientist who'd gotten lost in the huge mechanic's shadow. "But you have a lot to learn about how to use a wielder," he added, before smiling and throwing his tools to a side. Duke, who had mainly been an observer throughout the interaction, chuckled to himself, reveling in the fact that the scientist, who seemingly relied on compliments to his maverick brilliance, was being told that he just wasn't as brilliant as he thought. Evans, however, wasn't enjoying it nearly as much. He knew it was an activity he wasn't associated with, but he'd run the numbers. He was sure that he'd done it right, and this bumbling hulk of American was joking. Yet, before he could even begin to argue why his answers were seemingly given to him as Tide continued, "Here, look, you put it along here, which looks fine, but as soon as we take off and this all heats up, you're going to have a whole heap of mess," running his fingers through the old signs of handiwork upon the engine. Evans knew not to argue further with the master engineer, as much as his scientist interior wanted to. Tide walked through the door and headed back into the hull and up to the cockpit to find Pocket monitoring the outboard party. "They're about to enter a chasm," she stated, preempting Tide's question. "But that means we're going to lose contact for a while," she added. Looking up at her countryman, her small statue hid her brilliance. Incredibly adept at engineering and piloting, she found her place as a weapons expert on one of the most renowned ships in the fleet under the most famous captains. Joining up alongside Tide, they filled the slots that had appeared after a mission gone wrong, though they never were told what had happened. They relished the opportunity to fly to the open skies. At the time, she thought she never knew it would come to this. Working on one of the most important missions alongside a childhood friend, with a rare, serious look across his face, asked, "Weapons ready?" She nodded. The responsibility was what she had wanted, but now she wished she was anywhere else in the world. Now, this chapter is actually quite long, and I think I'm going to cut it there. We're already up to about 10 minutes here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to cut this chapter in two, since it's the last one, and it's quite a long chapter, and a lot happens. Trust me when I say there's a lot about to happen, and a lot to sort of read out and explain. So I don't want this episode to get turned into like a 30-minute episode, so I'm going to cut it here, and I'll see you next week in the following one where we end this chapter and probably have, like I say, a huge gap between the next chapter. So please message Fluke telling him to write more. It's an awesome story, and if you like this, please leave a like. I'll see you guys next time and have a very good day.